My guest today on Straight Talk is Tony Benn, former Labour Cabinet Minister, one of the great political diarists of our time, now a political campaigner outside Parliament. Tony Benn, you came from a well-established liberal left family through several generations before you. You followed where they trod. Were you never tempted to rebel in the other direction?
No, I mean, my parents were very influential. My dad was an old dissenter. He'd been a Liberal, opposed the Boer War, supported the Irish cause, and left the Liberal Party because of Lloyd George.
I'd moved to Labour.
Yes, and my mother was a deeply religious woman, a congregationalist, and the sense of justice and stand up for what you believe in was what really influenced me. And I never had any disposal to rebel in the ordinary teenage sense at all.
Now, you became an MP in 1950, not long after the war, and you had been in the war. You were aged, I think, only 25 at the time. Would it not be fair to say you were a bit of a moderniser? I mean, if perhaps you wanted to be rude, you were the Peter Mandelson of your day.
No, I wasn't. But remember, I'd been in the BBC for a period, and I was responsible. I went to Herbert Morrison and said broadcasting is very important, and I launched the Labour Party onto broadcasting, because the first time I took Nye Bevan, for example, to a studio to do a broadcast, he said he wanted a stand bike and he walked round it. And it was very, very interesting, and getting him to realise that broadcasting was quite different, but never in terms of abandoning our political faith, but in terms of using modern communications, which I think was very important.
But you weren't on the left in these days, were you? You weren't a Bevanite.
No, I wouldn't join. I was asked to join the Bevanites, but I'd only been in Parliament 6 months, and I thought I don't want to be within a group with their own whip so quickly. I have moved to the left as I've got older, which is what my dad did and his father did. And I think as you get older, you realise that just a sort of change of government doesn't necessarily change everything. You have to look at what lies beneath it. And so I have moved to the left as I've got older, that's true.
But when you, after being in Parliament for a long while, because you started as a young man, you then joined government when Mr. Wilson won in 1964. You were Postmaster General and then into the Cabinet as Minister for Technology, which was very important to Mr. Wilson at the time. Even then, you weren't, I don't think, identifiably of the left.
No, I think what happened was, and maybe it surprised you, my period in Cabinet persuaded me that there was a lot more wrong than just Tories on the fringe. You had really to look at where power had gone. And happened to my father as well, you see, when he was in the Cabinet in 1929 and again in 45. And he used to argue with me when I was a UMP. He said, British foreign policy is too dependent on the Americans. And I opposed him in a debate. So it is true, I have moved progressively to the left, based really on my experience of what I saw in Whitehall, where power really existed. Didn't exist as we told everybody.
Where did it exist?
Well, I mean, if you know nowadays, of course, Europe. We don't elect Peter Mandelson. We don't, if there's a European president, we won't elect him. European foreign minister, we won't elect him. The IMF, in a sense, brought down the Labour cabinet. Multinational corporations, far more powerful than governments. I dealt with the oil companies and so on. And you realise, unless you tackle that question, and as I got older, I became more and more persuaded about democracy.
Let's look a little, because this move to the left is interesting.
Yes.
And it's the opposite of what happens to a lot of people who tend to move to the right as they get older. Let's go back. It's 1964. You're in government.
Yes.
You come into government again in the 70s.
Yeah.
What was it? Was there any one single event or a moment or something that happened to you that thought, I'm in the wrong position here, I need to start moving more to the left?
Well, first of all, I put all my arguments in the Cabinet. It wasn't as if when we left office, I moved to the left. When I was there, I put arguments. And comparing Cabinet then with Cabinet now is so interesting. In January 1968, we had 8 full-day meetings of the Cabinet in a single month, morning and afternoon. We outvoted the Prime Minister sometimes. I would put in papers on all sorts of subjects.
That was Cabinet government?
That was Cabinet government. All gone, as Lord Butler said, when he was the Cabinet Secretary, not a single decision was taken. And that, I found, was the most interesting committee ever to be on, because you could put your case. Sometimes I won, occasionally. Quite often I lost. But there was a collective responsibility. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised power has moved elsewhere. And therefore you have to reopen the democratic argument. And that's, funnily enough, what interests me in part about Gordon Brown now, with the prerogatives which I've been arguing about.
Which we're going to talk about. But there wasn't one event. There wasn't something that happened, something you experienced.
Oil companies, hugely powerful, very, very threatening. The media, after all, I had a pretty rough time there, and I thought, what is it that gives them the right to, destroy people they don't care for? The role of the Bank of England, the IMF. I think it wasn't a conspiratorial view, it was just a recognition that we were moving from being a self-governing country. Because my dad said to me when I was elected, he said, if you're in Parliament, you control three things. The purse, that's the budget. The sword, that's the defence. And no Parliament can commit its successor. None of that is true. We don't control the purse, that's the IMF and the European Bank. We don't control the sword, that's NATO and the Americans. And one Parliament can commit a successor by agreeing to a law in Europe that no succeeding government could change. So it was that, thinking about that, and the reason I thought about it was partly because I had a lot of trouble with the House of Lords, where they said, because your blood's turned blue, you're ineligible to sit in Parliament. I couldn't believe it. It took me years, and that did come about. The change has occurred.
Which allowed you to become an MP. Your father
had been an
Viscount
MP. I'd been an MP for 10 years.
But then your father died.
Yes, and they tried to throw me out. I mean, that's fantastic, and at least on that campaign I succeeded.
You mentioned Europe earlier, and this move, this reassessment of things that you saw inside power. I mean, you had been part of a government, the cabinet, that had tried to join the European community.
Yes.
But after you lost the election in 1970, you turned against Europe, didn't you?
Well, it was again as experience, because you see, I think experience is the only real guide. It's what's happened to you. I was the president of the Council of Europe, of the Energy Ministers, Council of Energy Ministers, for 6 months, and I was on it for 4 years. It was the only committee I've sat on in my life where even as a member, let alone president, I was not allowed to put in a paper. Only the Commission could put in documents. And so here was something dominated by bureaucrats, like being a minister, and you could only consider what your permanent officials tell you. And it made it secret, and it made laws that applied in every country. And I mean, I was really shattered by that, and I thought about it afterwards, because one of the mistakes I did make was, in the early days, I thought the European Common Market would help us to control the multinationals, and I came to realize it subordinated our electorate to people we didn't elect.
You stayed in the Wilson-Callaghan governments through 74, when they beat Ted Heath, to 79. You were in industry and energy and so on. Clear from what you're saying, though, you were beginning to disagree with a lot of what that government was doing. When you look back, you never think, I should have got out. I should have made my stand, maybe over the IMF cuts in 76, or on the nuclear deterrent renewal, something. I should have made my mark then.
Well, I did a thing I don't suppose any cabinet has ever done. I went to my local committee in Bristol, and I said...
Of your constituency?
In my constituency. And I said, I want to discuss the problem I'm in, and you decide whether I resign from the cabinet or not. I put my future in their hands. And we discussed it, and they said, Tony, stay in, and if you're thrown out, we'll support you. But you see, the problem of resignation is quite an interesting one. If you resign from the cabinet, and then there's a vote of confidence in the government that night, do you vote for the government you've just left or not? If, as a result of losing it, there's an election, do you stand as a Labour candidate to get the government you've left re-elected or not? And I think it's better to, so long as you argue your case inside, which I did do quite consistently, and that's one thing my diaries have been able to establish, that even when I was a minister, during the period you described, I was arguing my case, and then later was able to make it more public.
Now, Margaret Thatcher won in 1979, and Labour left power for what was to be a long time.